Welcome to Therapist Uncensored, a podcast where therapists freely speak their minds about real-life matters.
Hey everybody, Sue Marriott here.
And I'm Ann Kelly. Welcome to Therapist Uncensored. And there is a national conversation happening every day right now. And we decided to bring this to Therapist Uncensored partly because it's happening in our practice, in our households. And
What conversation is that, Ann Kelly?
It is the national conversation about sexual harassment, sexual assault, about the media. We see it every day now. There's no way to wake up and turn on NPR or pick up your paper, and there is someone else that has an accusation, and just the level of magnitude of the amount of sexual assault that's happened in our culture throughout time, what's happening now, the power differential. It's a everyday dialogue right now.
That's right. We're seeing it in our practices. People who have never spoken of their stories are beginning to feel them, speak of them, and it is a exciting and power flip, really, as you know, there becomes safety in numbers and
the freedom. What you're saying is also sort of there's this process of when people start to have the dialogue and start to talk about it, and it's not the forbidden thing. There's an opening, there's a release, and then you have a lot of people talking about it, whether it's happening to them, people they love. There's what would you say? There's just an opening about it.
That's right. And for people who identify as women, it has been a most powerful power flip, strength in numbers. And in order to have this conversation, since we both identify as women, we thought it important to widen the conversation. So we have a very special guest with us today, someone who does not identify as a woman. His name is Mason Marriott Voss. And why don't you introduce yourself a little bit, Mason?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I'm currently a student here at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm excited to be here.
That's right. So we really wanted to widen the perspective, both from because it's a social media thing. Mason is very tied into that world and, some of the younger generation, and also as a white man in privilege. And so this is going to be fun.
This is definitely going to be fun. And one of the things that's so interesting, and one of I think the impetus and motivation for us doing this topic right now is we've mentioned both that we're seeing in our practice. And one of the things that's interesting is, and I'm going to imagine many listeners have experienced this. You open up the paper, somebody you know quite well, Louis C.K., Kevin Spacey, any number every day. And you start to talk with somebody you trust, you love, your husband, your wife, your partner, and the conversation starts out often with, oh my God, can you believe this has happened, right? And you're on the same side and you're talking about it. But how often does that digress into conflict?
That's right. I see it actually in groups where we have mixed gender groups, and all of a sudden the steam gets rolling, and the guys, I just see them shrinking in their chairs
or getting mad.
Yeah. Right. That's right. So it becomes very tense, and we want to talk about how to handle these things. Holidays are certainly coming up, and this is a touchy, intimate, painful conversation. So Mason, what are your thoughts from the male perspective on this?
I'll start with actually sort of a thought I've been having about sort of conversations that's been happening, which is the sort of not all men conversation that a lot of people like to say, like hashtag not all men. I want to start with it is all men. Not necessarily that all men are necessarily perpetrators of assault, but all men are definitely complicit within a system that helps make that acceptable. If you can look at yourself as a man and say, I know that I have not committed any acts of sexual assault, but I would be surprised if you could look at yourself as a man and say, I know that I have been an active participant in preventing sexual assault. And if you're not being that active participant in doing everything you can to prevent that, shutting down derogatory comments about women in groups of all men, etc., if you're not doing those things, actively intervening with men who are doing those kinds of things, then you are part of that problem. And we all are. All of the men that I have been around, that I've interacted with, in some way, shape, or form, contribute to and definitely benefit from this system of systemic power that we all operate within. So it really is all men. That being said, there are definitely people who identify as male, trans men, who I have heard from a couple of them, some friends of mine, who want to make it clear that maybe it is hashtag not all men, because they are male. They are definitely identify as male. They are very much real men, but are actually more statistically much higher likelihood of being victims of these forms of sexual assault, sexual harassment than a lot of other groups and categories. So we do want to be careful when talking about a male problem. We want to make sure that yes, there is definitely a patriarchal system that influences and controls these dialogues, but that there are groups within that are slightly sort of pushed to the sides of those conversations.
Yeah, it makes me think of bullying in general, which, is related to power.
The bystander effect.
And exactly. And that when your social status goes up by being the one that humiliates and is degrading, then it's very, very, very hard to intervene. But as I think your point is, if we can change the social status so that what is cool and what raises your social status is speaking up and calling people out and things like that. Intervening, absolutely. But without that, if your social status goes up, Charlie Sheen, for example, our president, if your social status goes up with this kind of patriarchal power, it's like, this is part of why we're talking about this. And Anne, your point about when people that love each other and that start out on the same side, all of a sudden something happens. And the dynamic that was being talked about out there, the power dynamic, happens right there within the couple.
Oh, it's so powerful. And Mason, I really, really like your point about, can we get out there? One thing I notice is, of course, as couples start to talk about it, and if we're talking about a heterosexual couple, so a woman is talking about maybe their experience about Harvey Weinstein, or honestly Trump, I see personally in my practice, and this isn't specifically a political left-right issue at all. I see women with both political parties feeling very almost traumatized. Well, not almost, actually traumatized about having a president who has actually engaged in sexual assault, has acknowledged it at least. Bragged about it, and that their experience of that actually feels somewhat traumatic. And what's interesting about that is often their male spouse or brother support that. I mean, like, they get it, and they start in a conversation of support and care.
But then I hear a bum, bum, bum.
Yeah. In the end.
That's what happens.
Well, in the end, they end up conflicting. And I want us to engage in a dialogue, and what I appreciate having a male perspective in this. There's some things that I see happen that I propose we talk about that could help explain that, because I think it ends up leaving couples sort of feeling, especially men, I see that a lot, I'm on your side. They'll turn and look at me and going, I'm on her side. Why do I feel like the enemy in this conversation? And often, Mason, what I hear is, I don't do that. I haven't done that. And of course, when your spouse or sibling is getting incredibly upset, you have a tendency to want to defend yourself. And I would imagine as a male,
in any scenario.
Have you found yourself in that position as a male, where around women who feel passionate and you feeling a desire yourself to defend?
Yeah, it almost feels like sometimes it might feel like almost a requirement. Like, I've got to first establish myself as the good guy, as like on your side or on your team.
So one of the thoughts I have is that as you watch it, there is a culture we have where we must acknowledge, and I'll get your perspective on this, Mason, that men sometimes can approach this from a more analytical. They want to have a conversation. They want to analyze it and think about it. And they're dialoguing often, in my experience, about it as kind of a point of interest, not a care, a concern. They're there, but they can talk about it in a way that sounds educational, informational, problem solving. And they haven't actually experienced the threat of that. Of course, I'm not talking about all men. Many men have obviously been harassed and assaulted. So I guess we're talking more about the sort of the power differential. And what I notice is that women, and you're mentioning, Sue, that there's not that many women who don't have a Me Too somewhere in their history. When we were talking about this topic, their body is having an alarm. They are recognizing and now talking about something that's been released that they've experienced. that's been very traumatic to them. So as they're talking about it, their body's actually in a state of alarm, while men, I observe, are talking about it supportively, but a little analytically and from an information standpoint. And that incongruence is what I see contributes quite often to the escalation. That's what I'm observing. What are y'all's thoughts on that?
I think that, at least from the sort of outsider's perspective, I think that it's that ability and then therefore subsequent inability to have that physical reaction that you're talking about. I think that a lot of people, a lot of specifically more likely men, have never been in a situation where they've had that fear, that power dynamic.
Have you ever had the feeling of threat like that?
I haven't. I honestly haven't. And so I can honestly say that there is no possible way I could imagine what being in that situation would be like. I don't even have the beginnings of what that perspective would be. And so it's really hard as a man who's never been in a situation where I would be literally without power, where I'd felt vulnerable in myself, where I felt like my body could be violated or was being violated. It's really, I don't know how to connect with that. It's really hard to make that jump because I can't. It's impossible for me to imagine. It's an unspeakable act of violence that I can't even comprehend. So those conversations on Anne was talking about almost was that interpersonal level is very challenging for men or anyone who hasn't been in those experiences to have, because it's hard to relate to that.
Right. And that's just so insightful to know that you don't understand, where I think, and some of what you're talking about is people think they understand. And there's, most men don't sit around saying, I really don't get this. It's more of like, yeah, that would be terrible. And,
let's talk about it. Let's think about it,
exactly.
from a cultural perspective, or let's analyze it.
What has it been like for you? Like, tell me more about it. So we'll get into some of the suggestions about how to make this go better, hopefully. But it makes me think about, some of the research that says that when you say, what is the most threatening thing in the opposite sex? And of course, women say being raped or killed right away. And then if you ask a man that, a man will typically say something like being laughed at by a woman. And I've gotten into arguments with men about this where they're like, no, but that is the same thing. It is violating and intrusive, but it's more of like, you're in a position right now that you, and how have you cultivated this awareness that you really don't get it?
I think the best way to answer that question is to simply expose yourself, not actually expose yourself, but be. Let's be very careful about our wording here. Is to let yourself be exposed to other ideas and not other ideas, but other perspectives on an issue, and to have or to listen to those conversations as they occur around you, and to recognize that, wow, this is just beyond my scope of understanding. And sitting in a circle and hearing those conversations, hearing those stories being told, or even looking at all the Me Too's on Facebook, or however you get your exposure to all of this just evolving conversation, just allowing yourself to recognize that there's a whole section of the world and what happens in the world that you were just not aware of or have never been able to interact with. And that first incongruency is where you can really begin to understand the magnitude of your inexperience.
Or you notice that there is a gap.
Absolutely.
And another thing that makes me think of is that where men have said before, oh, okay, I get it, is when, or at least a clue to it, is heterosexual man who gets the willies or whatever, either perceiving or imagining being checked out by a gay man. And that begins to get at like this unwanted attention and this feeling of creepiness. But that's about as close as I've heard somebody kind of talk about it as well.
And it's often older, right? Like, I don't know that that's the experience of the younger population. Even
Right.
that probably, I don't know. What's your opinion?
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely heard that example as well before. And I feel like it kind of gets there. I'm sure that resonates with some individuals, but I know that myself, or even some of my friend group as well, has a harder time relating to that as sort of such a insecure place.
Mm-hmm. As actually physically threatening.
Right. It's not as
or upsetting.
threatening or
That whole idea isn't as threatening.
And you were saying, Anne, about the biology of this and threats.
Right.
So just to go back.
Yeah, to go back to the biology of it. So I'm curious to ask you another question, Mason, in this, in that you were saying that one of the things to do is you have to sit in a room and with, let's just say, a man sitting in a room with women talking about this. And again, I'm saying that women often, when they start to talk about it from a heightened state, right?
Yeah.
And is that your experience? Like you see women get like a lot more agitated than if a man's talking about it. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, for sure.
So you're seeing the body heightened. I would say, that may be challenging to not feel, because when we have somebody heightened and talking at us more intensely, it instigates a defensive posture in our body just because of that.
It instigates our own threat response.
Yeah. It's like, why are you getting so intense with me? I'm on your side, right? And it's really hard to absorb that, to be the object for somebody, to go, of course you're that intense. That must be horrible. It's just hard to do for anybody. And then I do think men right now are sort of the subject that I can imagine as a man feeling sort of the subject of a lot of hostility as a culture. Would you agree? And
yeah, for sure. There's a definite need to sort of validate yourself and defend yourself and say, no, that's not me.
Right, especially when you feel something going, wow, and then I'm wondering I was really interested when you were thinking about the idea of sitting in a room and going, this is an experience that I don't know. So again, I'm asking you as a male representative and expert. In my experience, you're like, well,
we'll use that term loosely.
Thank you. Okay, but I see that sometimes in our culture that is really hard for men to do, to sit in a room and say, I don't know. Would you agree with that? Absolutely.
I think that specifically as a white male, there's an often tendency, for myself, but I'll generalize a little bit and say that in the majority of white men that I'm around, there's a tendency to know everything. And if you don't know something, then something's wrong with you. Or if you can't explain or articulate something, then something's wrong with you. And that's often interpreted sort of as like the male answer syndrome, to just jump in and say whatever you want to say. But I think that in these conversations and being present in these conversations, the most important part is knowing when to not say anything, knowing when to let others speak, to let other opinions into the room, and to really hear your gap in knowledge, to recognize that you're way outside of the realm of experience. And so that maybe your opinion or stray thought doesn't need to be interjected in this exact moment.
Oh, amen to that.
There's a time and place for you to have your conversation, and in a circle of a bunch of women having this talking about it amongst themselves. I think that as a male or someone who identifies as male, it's important to recognize that your role in that situation is mostly to listen and to learn, and to contribute in the small ways, the joining with, the simple, yes, I see how that would be terrible, the simple, I can't even begin to fathom what that experience could be like. And then I think the place for more active conversation or more involvement, more active interjection, I guess, by men is within circles of men. And this is something I sort of hinted at earlier. It's that the active intervention, the stopping of any sort of reconstitution of a power dynamic that exists within circles of men. If a group of men start objectifying a woman or catcalling her, etc., if you're in that circle and you don't actively intervene to stop it, you've done a disservice to the community and to the world at large.
Yeah, but that typically doesn't happen, right?
Oh, for sure. That is very rare. It's seen almost as weak to interject and to be like, "Hey, dude, don't say that," or "What are you doing?"
Or even if you think about speaking about what you're hearing that is publicly happening, whether it's with our president or these individuals, how you speak about it, and sometimes because there's a need right now, or what I see, kind of a feeling of defense, because a lot of men are feeling defensive, and understandably on some level, because you're hearing a lot of hostility about, this is not just today's issue, right? This is throughout time and throughout culture. This power differential between men and women has existed. And one would say, like, hopefully that we're shortening that gap. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe that's our hope.
I think we're just becoming more aware of that gap.
More aware, and I think women getting the freedom to speak about it more, rather than being eye rolled or seen as ridiculous. I think that, to me, is what I'm seeing, sort of the feeling of almost release And so when I see women wanting to talk and getting very elevated, it's like this sense of release. We get to say this sucks. And being able to do that, and like what you're saying, Mason, have somebody go, wow, that, I didn't realize. That must be, like, to be able to not have the answers and try to pontificate about it, but really feel heard. That's what the wives are looking for, not your insights as much. Not saying you don't want to engage in that dialogue, but I guess one of the suggestions I would make, if you see that person, the woman in your life, starting to elevate about it, is like to be curious about it and to be caring rather than to move into a defensive posture that says, wait, that's not me. That's not me.
Yeah, and to use your power to help her speak and to help her be heard. And whether this applies to race and those power dynamics, but like whoever's in the power position, to use our power to draw the other person out and create safety. Because honestly, part of sexual trauma, there's the event that happened, but then there's the event and set of events that happen after it happens. And that is really, I think, what is resonating right now is there collusion? Are you believed? Are you silenced? Are you punished? Are you
judged for waiting so long? Like, why?
Right.
A lot of people are like, why are they speaking now? Right?
Are you questioned?
Right.
That your experience isn't true. Is there another attempt to like confuse your mind? Like, did that happen? Did it not happen? Like, the second wave of it is equal to, or at times worse than, because if a bad thing happens and you're able to say this thing happened and people surround you and say that's a terrible thing that happened, we're going to protect you and we believe you and we're going to get this person and remove them and make sure that this never happens to you again. That's an event that goes down in your body, as you're talking about, Ian, really differently than when it's invisible and that you feel colluded, or like some sort of, like somehow you've been made to feel that you're part of it or that you caused it because of just the dynamic that happens, the grooming that happens.
Well, yeah. And those, I think Harvey Weinstein was a really big example.
Yes.
Oh, hugely of that, where it was a very difficult conversation because you could hear some people, not just men, women too, saying, well, but these women didn't have to do that. Right? Because they didn't have to. They, it really was their choice. Like some people could say, I know one conversation I overheard was some people could say that, some people give up their careers. They don't have to make that choice. They can keep their integrity instead of giving up their integrity. Oh boy, when I watched that conversation, and it was not in my therapy office, I'm not revealing any kind of confidential information here, but boy, if I'd have seen feathers on the back of a neck go up, because what you're saying is if you held and participated in that, somehow you didn't have integrity was implied. And and it was really evident in this conversation that this person that had said that had never really been in a role to have their entire well-being in somebody else's hands. And Harvey, that was...
If there's a power dynamic that exists almost to any degree, you've lost any ability to control the outcome of that situation. The idea that the victims could have done something differently is almost as laughable as like the she was asking for a narrative that a lot of people, I think hopefully, at least I've seen less of it, have stopped pushing. I think that the just idea that there's a choice involved in any encounter of assault is really silly.
So what about then going back to Louis C.K.? Is that his?
Yes,
Louis C.K.
With the times.
No, I'm not with the times. That's why you're
got some age differential here.
But there are a ton of people that obviously weren't there and haven't seen it, but his fans that are completely supporting him and feel like he's being misunderstood. Just as one example. So what about that? Because that's exactly what happened with Trump, right? And
eye roll, everybody's making too big of a deal.
Boys will be
or
boys.
the classic, that was a part of the times, right? We're in different times, so we shouldn't be holding people accountable to the different times, which is, I guess, not Louis C.K. So what are your thoughts about that, Mason?
Well, to speak on Louis C.K. actually briefly, I think that he's actually a better example of how to handle the situation. His response to the allegations was to just straight up admit it. He was like, yes, that was me. I did those things. They were wrong. And I think that I'm curious to see how he accepts the consequences of those things and if I'll continue to agree that he handled it correctly. But as of now, I think he's handling it fairly well in terms of how you should respond to allegations or accusations of sexual assault. But I do think that is an interesting question. Like, do you continue to support or back somebody? And what does that look like? Like, for example, Kevin Spacey, I think, is someone a lot of people are talking about in terms of, like, before all of this came out, I definitely thought he was a fantastic actor. He's one of my favorite actors. But now, how do I interact with his work, his movies? It's definitely sort of shaded the lens through which I view all of his work, knowing sort of what he did behind the scenes. But this is a conversation that really, how to view work after somebody said something bad, has been going on for a while, especially in the realm of sports. There are a lot of, like,
yes,
OJ is a great example, but it goes back forever of examples of sports, like athletes who either get caught cheating or
beating up,
kill somebody,
yes.
or some other form,
sexual
even
assault.
sexual assault. The sexual assault is a lot newer coming out. The older stuff that people were accused for was a lot more, like in the 50s and stuff, was a lot of cheating stuff. And how do you view their work after they've done something like that? And I think that's something not a lot of people have really come to solid answers on. But I definitely think it sort of colors the way we look at what they've done and presented to the public as their products.
Yeah, it makes me think of Bill Cosby and Woody Allen and the story around, Mia trying to get her story out and being absolutely squashed. And then the establishment really rallying around Woody Allen. He still works. He's still very successful in the field. And so, yeah, you're right. So how, I guess some of it is, there has to be men listening out there, either to us right now or seeing this on their Facebook feeds, that have done this. It's like, what about them? What would we ask if we could ask something of them? What would we ask of them?
The men who've committed assault?
Yes, the many, 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 many men that must be part of this.
Well, I think that, like I sort of said earlier, I think all men are part of this system.
Mm-hmm.
I think you are lying to yourself as a man if you think you have not enabled any of this in any way,
the patriarchy.
in any way, shape, or form.
So one of the things then that would add to the dialogue, as you've been saying, it would be not to be focusing on not me, right?
It's a very natural reaction to have, but it is you, I guess, in a as non-accusatory way as I could say that, sort of, like, because I understand the impulse. I promise you, I understand the impulse.
You have it sometimes.
I have it all the time when these conversations happen. I want to clarify, this is definitely not me. I have not done these things, but I've contributed to a system, be it not even directly, but just in the indirect bystander nature of my contribution. I have allowed this system to exist and continue to exist. And it's only in the active intervention in that system that we stop it. So I guess to answer your question, Sue, it's really about being able to, what do we ask with people who have committed that assault? I don't know if that's a come forward question, because now you get into questions of maybe outing survivors who don't want to be outed, but definitely some recognition or just acceptance of what you have done, and being able to at least have enough of a backbone to recognize that you did a terrible thing, and not either miscrediting or saying that the accusers are just doing it for attention, or doing some other publicity stunt to sort of distract from that conversation, whatever it may be. Just at least, to use a sexist phrase, man up. Right? I don't really like that phrase a lot, but have a backbone. Understand when you've made a mistake and admit to it.
Well,
go ahead.
Well, and also, I guess it depends on what you're owning up to, right? And I appreciate your response that if you're owning up to something that's going to out somebody, to really be able to be aware of that, and whether it's active engagement in it. And it depends on what it is. Think about things that you might not have even recognized. I imagine some people are now having the experience of, oh my God, like I didn't even sort of let myself recognize that power differential and taking advantage of it. So you probably historically go back and have this kind of feeling of, I've certainly experienced that with clients. And to be able to kind of come forward and go, wow, we might differ a little bit on Louis C.K.'s good job, but I've noticed that some women are having a little bit of a hard time because he kept saying that, sorry, I took advantage that they admired me. He never talked about...
You're right. I don't like that language.
Yeah, he never talked about his power differential. In fact, he sort of kept his admiring role, right? So I think a lot of women... I noticed that men... Well, I can't across the board, just my experience, that men generally felt more satisfied with that. And I do understand what you're saying. At least he came out and said, I did it. But women felt him not identifying the power differential. So if you go back, for instance, and you think about your own power differential and you know you used it, number one is you don't do it to your best of your ability and make amends.
What do you think making amends looks like? Like, what would you like to see from those men who do get called out and who do recognize when they've made a mistake?
Well, that's kind of where I was going with, if I can challenge you just a little bit, because you're saying, it sounds really good what you're saying, but do you, around like, I'm a perpetrator, I've been part of this and stuff like that, but how do you feel about that? And you're sitting here with two women and you're saying, I have intentionally or unintentionally, either way. Right. But just because I think if we don't kind of go into the difficulty, because that sounds really good.
It's hard to
do. But if we don't go into the real difficulty of why were you a bystander? And really honestly, and how, do you really mean it when you say you're part of this? Can you really feel it?
Yeah, I think that is a very excellent point, and something that the really feeling it or really meaning it part is definitely a goal to be achieved. I know that sort of cognitively on an intellectual level, I fully understand the implications of my decisions to act or not act in specific instances, to call out somebody for catcalling a woman, etc., or to even greater degrees. I'm sure some people have just been bystanders in very physical acts of assault, etc. And I think all of those things are part of that. But it is really hard to honestly be that reflective and to look at yourself and make those calls and be like, yes, I should have done something differently in that moment. And it's definitely a struggle. And I think that the easiest way to do that and to own up to that is to start by being an active interventionist. It's really hard to start by first saying, I am complicit in this system. I think the first thing that's easier to do is to see something, and then, like all the ads say something. To just even small stuff, catcalling, etc. Example I keep using, because I think it's the easiest to call out really quickly, easily, and shut it down. Just be like, hey, dude, give an example don't do that, etc. And in doing that, you can start pushing back against those systems. And once you do that, you'll notice. Once you start doing that, you'll begin to notice more and more how many times you haven't done it in the past.
But can you give an example of, have you begun to do this?
Absolutely. I've definitely taken steps to intervene.
So how does that look? Can you really paint a picture of how does it actually sound over there in the men's world?
Are you at a party? Are you?
Yeah, no, really. How crude is it? What has actually happened?
I mean, an example that comes to my mind is for my graduation, not my graduation, but for a end of year party, we all went to Schlitterbahn, which is a big group of my friends and everything. And I will say that my friend group was almost entirely women, but there were a couple other guys there. And so we were at Schlitterbahn, and one of my friends just was just pointed to one of the girls who was just sunbathing, not in our friend group, just a random girl who was sunbathing out on a towel, and he was like, no, she looks pretty good. And my response to that, and actually my friend's response as well, the two of us both turned to him and just was that necessary? I think is what my other friend actually said to him. It's was that really necessary? There's no reason to call that out or to do that. I understand that's a sort of a smaller example, because that wasn't, she didn't hear that. There was no other implications of that, but it's one of those steps, and it's just a small thing that builds. And if you can do that, if you can be really, was that necessary? I don't think that was you didn't need to do that. That's
right,
not
just like a tap. Right?
Yeah, just dude, chill.
What I like about that is it's not humiliating to the person, because I think that's something right now that we're doing in the culture a lot that is making it sort of a threat. Is there's a lot of finger wagging and shaming, which again is not the easiest way for someone like you're saying to kind of, when we're like, men are this and men are that, it's pretty hard to kind of go, yes, I suck, right? But what you're saying is was that necessary? Which is what we always say on the podcast, is that's face saving. It probably wasn't. You didn't dude,
give them an out.
Give them out.
You don't
and then
have
move
to
on.
Call them out and shame them for it entirely.
Right.
I mean, obviously, if they're doing something egregious, you should probably definitely intervene and do whatever you can to avoid just the tap on the shoulder if it's a bigger problem, you should definitely intervene more there. But for sure, just little taps to nudge people back into their own lanes.
So can I bring in, I'm sitting here thinking about I'm imagining listeners, hopefully if we have a wide enough range, going, are you serious? Really? What's wrong with checking out a hot girl? And, that's a compliment to her. Like, why do you think she's wearing that? Because she wants to look good.
She wants people to be looking at her. If she wouldn't be wearing a bikini, right?
Like that. Yeah. Like, I really, right? Is that not, I'm hearing it in my head. I can.
Yeah, sure. I guess the simplest answer I have to that is if she really is, let's just assume that she is wearing that swimsuit just so that other people will check her out. If that's true, why do you have to do that out loud? You can do that in your head. That's not something that needs to be.
So you're cool with it. You're cool with enjoying the hot girl laying there with her bathing suit on.
Well, I mean,
you're gonna appreciate.
Yeah, sure, but it's also really hard. You can't police that. There's no way to control what happens inside someone's head.
Right.
Now, should you objectify and only quantify women or men based on how they appear, etc.? Probably not. But to some extent, that's really unavoidable. And yeah, maybe we can assume that she is just wearing that swimsuit, so you'll think that or make that comment. But it doesn't need to be like, was it necessary? It doesn't need to be said out loud. Just keep it in your head. Because I think if that is directed, like what if she's wearing that swimsuit because it makes her feel good about her body? She doesn't care what. Or right. I don't. I'll speak more from my own subject position. I wear a swimsuit, right? Just rather bathing trunks. I don't care what you have to think about my body. I don't. You can think whatever you want as long as it stays in your own head. All I care about is the way I feel in my own skin. And if I feel comfortable or if I feel good in whatever I'm wearing, if I'm wearing an outfit that looks great, I don't need you to get all up in my business to sort of impose your own interpretation of that on me. I'm wearing it for myself, not for you.
So don't make assumptions.
So don't assume.
You don't get to project what I think that's part of what we're saying is you don't get to project what your assumption is about that person's desire or intent and then rationalize your ability to then speak out loud. And let's be honest, oftentimes that exact same situation is said loud enough for the woman to hear.
Absolutely.
Right, right. So occasionally it's just to the left and, but it's often said intentionally loud enough. And I think many women have experienced that as a power differential and as an experience where men somehow at times have been mistakenly believing that some woman is going to enjoy that experience. And I'm not saying some women don't. I'm not left or right on that. But to assume that she wants that and to then project that on her with no choice and to have men talking about it right now is so, I think for me to hear it as such a everyday conversation, I'm relieved by it.
Right. And, I want to keep incorporating, like, sometimes we want to be objectified.
Sure.
Like, that's not, this isn't an anti-sexual,
be proud
prudish.
of who you are.
Oh my gosh. I'm just having this memory. You said that. I remember when I was young working in a kitchen and I would walk through and get catcalls. And I remember talking to my mom about this. And literally, though, my mom was very liberal. And so I'm sort of shocked at her response. And I remember her saying, honey, it's when they stop calling you need to worry. And now I understand that. So I didn't want that. And I was sort of shocked when she said it. Now I get it, but it is sort of a confusing response for me.
Right, because there's such a thing as healthy, sort of a somewhat forward sexuality. And I want to just be talking about this in a really grounded way of leaving lots of rooms for just, the various sexual expressions and the health of that and the empowerment of that.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to set a definition of what guys can or can't say to women in a bar or at a pool, etc. I think that all you can do as a man is sort of check yourself. And I guess a way to do this is if you have a sister or maybe or if you have a mother that or any family member, that just first, before you say anything, think, would I want to hear someone else say this to X female member of my family?
Yeah. Would I want somebody speaking to my daughter or my wife?
And the answer is Probably not.
Yeah.
Honestly. And in which case, then why is it necessary for you to say it out loud?
And to assert your experience, because
and you can then, and what that means is that doesn't mean necessarily you don't say anything to that girl. It maybe means you just change what you say. You can there are definitely more respectful ways to comment on a woman's dress than whatever crude like pun you were going to make in the first place. You can avoid all that by just imagining, just put yourself on the outside of the situation and think, would that feel weird if that happened to someone else?
You know, it makes me think of an interview that we did with Doug Braun Harvey talking about the principles of healthy sexuality. And one of the big ones, of course, is consent and mutuality and non-exploitation. Those were a couple of them, actually. And so how about something like, we are all thumbs up for sexual objectification as long as it's a mutual experience.
With consent.
That's right.
It's kind of like what you talk about with kids when you say humor in a joke is not funny unless both people laugh.
That's right.
Right? So when you're making a joke at somebody else's expense, and it's a kind of you can feel the hostility, and when you're laughing because the other person's feeling humiliated, that's not a funny joke. And so when you're projecting, going back to my examples about the cat calls and the whistles, I can literally still in my body feel the humiliation I felt, right? I think I was 14 or 15. And I can literally viscerally feel the humiliation I felt because the kitchen was really long and I had to experience it walking all the way through. And so I can physically talk about that. And so when somebody, to go back to our original example, if I'm in a conversation with somebody saying, look, I don't think whistling and catcalling is that big of a deal. You know, what we're really, and women like to be objectified and women like to know, come on, right? I can relate to wanting to, reach out, like slap out, and what am I looking for?
Punch.
To punch.
Kick.
Yes. I'm like, are you like really what starts coming up is the frontal lobe is expletives. What the effing are you thinking about that you would think that I would want that?
If you're a dude, what are you doing saying things like women want X?
Yes.
I really don't know why, like, guys think that they understand like
what women
want. I think that, I don't know, y'all are the therapist experts, but I would imagine that there's often a miscommunication about those things that occur. And so if you're going to make a generalization about women want to be objectified, that kind of assumes you understand all women on a fundamental level, which I don't think anyone can understand all of any group on a fundamental level, but especially male to female interactions. It feels like a disconnect. I don't know. Y'all are the experts on that.
No, that's great. I think that's funny. And then and women doing it too. So I'm struck by, like, you had this great humor about, like, oh, now you know what your mom meant. But also, if we really just sort of listen, it's like that was a humiliating experience for you, that you go to a protective person. And later in your adult life, you can look back and like, oh, she was so right, because you're not in that humiliated experience. But I think sometimes women unintentionally do that to other women too.
Oh, actually. And because she was of a different generation. I mean, all you have to go look for my mom is look at Mad Men, right? And so that was her culture, right? And so it was like, oh God, it was kind of like, well, that's going to always happen, right? And so we're talking about cultural differences as much reason why we, or generational differences to have somebody younger on the program, because it does change from we're hoping, like it's changing.
I think clearly it's changing in some way, shape, or form.
It is, because now I'm like, if my daughter said that somebody was catcalling, and I know the deeper part of my mom would never think that was okay, right? But her culture, I mean, she was raised in an absolutely Mad Men. I used to visit her at work, and I can remember the kind of dynamics of how the boss would treat the women. And it was very, very, I mean, now to have your children watch Mad Men, they would look at you like you had 5 heads, but that was my mother's real experience. And it was not my experience, and hopefully not my daughter's experience. So I want to have hope that it's just part of this dialogue as it's helping to get better and better. But boy, we have a long way to go. We do know that.
Well, and I can really hear the difference even in some of Mason's stories, because I think that what we're calling catcalling or the boy talk, I think it's changed. I don't think it's the way it used to be. And even when you responded, when I said about if you identify as heterosexual and you imagine men leering at you or whatever, and you kind of shrug and like, what's the harm in that? You know, that's flattering. I've heard you say before. So, it has changing a lot. And it's changing a lot, and it's not. Like, we can really feel the pushback. Like, who did we just elect?
Right. I think that's what I was going to say. It's changing, and yet when we can have the backlash, and I think getting back to our original point of that we see a lot of threat happening right now, which is one reason why we wanted to do this podcast and this episode, is to speak to that, to help actually impact the threat. Because some of the threat is, in fact, that what we're talking about right now in the Weinsteins and things, how much it's embedded in our culture and how much it's been supported. I mean, these are not things that have been happening and nobody knew about it. These are things that has been deeply entrenched and accepted. And so to be everybody's outrage, partly not because it's happening, because it's been accepted. And so I think one of the things we said we were going to do in this podcast is to continue. We've done some already about some ideas.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was about to go.
Yeah, let's talk about some more ideas because I'm talking about it. I also feel very compassionate for men in those positions. I don't think I came across compassionate, but I do feel like I feel compassionate for men feeling like that they really try to not be those people, and yet their spouses or whatever is getting hostile. That's not an easy position.
So let's talk real quickly then about how do we create a safe dialogue for everybody to
like, how do we
safety.
Make that dialogue go where we're staying on the same tune, we're talking about it. How do we end as friends and not foe?
So how do we do that?
I think that I've sort of mentioned a little bit of this earlier, but just from a male perspective, if we're using a heterosexual married couple as the example, the husband in that situation, I think just recognizing that you are not the authority on the subject, that it is not your time or place.
You hear that, guys? Listen up. Wait, say that again.
You are not the authority on the subject.
That's hard, though, isn't it?
It's
Mason,
very hard.
Can you talk about that from a male perspective? That can be challenging.
It's super challenging. It's hard for me to do that in my own experience, and just giving up that authority is something that's really difficult to do. But I think that the most important thing to do is just listen to what the women around you want, which is why I wanted to ask y'all, what would y'all suggest as the best way to approach or resolve these problems interpersonally amongst husband and wife, or just friends of different genders, etc.? Women are the most qualified to answer that question, I feel like.
I think for me, one of the things that I think I want and that I see go well is just what you're saying. Somebody be going, God, I had no idea how bad it was and how hard it is. Empathy, not jumping to solving the problem or giving opinions about why it is that way. I think when you immediately start feeling alarmed and somebody starts giving opinions and thoughts about why it is that way in a defensive posture, I can feel myself edge up. And I think going, good God Almighty, this is so hard. Really, I can't imagine. And it really has been, what ways have you experienced it? Asking questions.
Right. And, empathy is tricky given if we roll back to what we started with, which was if you've never had that experience and you have really fundamentally never felt threatened, how do we get to empathy? And I think that is a real challenge. And so I really love this notion of coming to awareness of these gaps. And that's why I asked you to say it again. It's like that we don't know and that is threatening. And now we're moving into a more empathetic stance when you have to give up power and give up some of the safety. Now we're moving a little closer together and not know instead of know, those sorts of things. And also perhaps even, one exercise that used to happen on the campus actually, and this was back when you actually had to do this to get empathy for example, in sexual ed or whatever, okay, we're going to talk about homosexuality. That's what they called it back then. And one of the assignments was that you needed to walk down the drag, which is a very busy street here in Austin, holding hands with a same-sex person. And that was the only way to kind of get the experience of like the humiliation or the fear. And all of a sudden you're looking around and that really immersing yourself. And so I wonder if there's a version of that with this. And not to be graphic, but really letting yourself go to these empathetic places of like, what was that like? Really listening, really helping. I don't want to keep saying the woman, because it's not always the woman that has been victimized.
Whoever's been victimized,
whoever's in that position, to really work to get in their shoes and work to imagine what that might be like. And I think it is work. I think it's really conscious, active intent. And so it's not going to be fast, and it's not going to be natural necessarily.
Well, one of the things I love what you're saying is in the process of doing that, if we just stick again to maybe the male doing that for a female that's talking, that's upset, if instead of defending, which puts you in a, we defend because we feel weak and attacked, so we go to a defensive to be more powerful. The very act of going, tell me more, and really not knowing actually changes that power dynamic right then.
Absolutely.
Letting the woman be angry and being there to say, God, I get it. Not, I'm the good guy.
Yeah.
You're right. I don't get it. And not to fight to be the good guy. That can come later. But to be the one that actually goes into a submissive role at that moment.
Yes.
And just by saying, I don't get it. I really don't get it. Tell me more.
I can't even comprehend what that would be like.
Yes.
But I would like to, and tell me more. And so asking questions, that's another thing that it matters a lot to me. I really notice if somebody asks questions or not, because it's like, do you want to know what's in my mind? And do you care to know what's in my heart? And do you care to be willing to experience the pain that I may talk about, or the disorganization, or the experience of that? And without really kind of feeling drawn out, I think many people will make that assumption of like, not that interested. We don't normally talk about this. I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to make anybody else feel bad.
But tell me more, and draw somebody else. And
what was the worst part? You could say things like, what was the worst part?
Why didn't anybody listen to you? What was that like?
How
working?
often has this happened?
Right. Questions of curiosity. Mm-hmm. And I think for men's behalf, I think for women who are feeling stirred up and challenged, and they know their spouse is not really support you, is sometimes to be able to say, I am so angry. You are not the bad guy. I do not think you're the bad guy. You aren't the bad guy, but can you please listen? Like somehow giving that person the out to say, I sound angry at you, and I am. Can you handle it? It's really not you. I mean, if you can just say it's really not you, but I really need to be mad, that goes a long way to helping the man in your life become the listener. Would you agree, Mason?
Yeah, no, that is, hearing that and being able to hear that really helps with what we were talking about sort of a lot earlier, which is the defensive posture that men often immediately take.
Yes.
And being able to get over that initial defensive flare-up really can help you as a man help like really connect with that moment and being able to experience whatever your partner or whatever wants to share with you about that information.
That's right, because the male script, because we've got the female script and the male script is to fix it or to do something about this. And that moves
feel
us
responsible.
To feel responsible. That's right. And it's part of what moves people into an active position of, either handing them the Kleenex or, something that is unintentionally shutting down, versus this open place that we're talking about that is actually much more vulnerable of being willing even to hear the details of the story. A lot of people are really scared to ask about things like that because they don't want to make the other person feel bad. But what I would say is like, there's a way to really show your interest and ask with obvious respect that if they don't want to talk about it. But I can tell you, most women will not have had very much the experience of someone saying, and then what happened? And how far did it go? And what, like really telling the story. And so anybody listening right now, like, yeah, if we could it's like tuning in to these stories. The reason that your Facebook feed is full of this is that we haven't had room to tell, and we haven't had people asking, and we haven't had people interested. We've actually typically, I would say, experienced more of the shutdown and the move along and owning too much responsibility for it.
It's not. And I love what you're saying, because part of saying, tell me more, is you have to sit with your own experience of helplessness.
Yes.
So some reasons
that's empathy.
Right. We jump to fix it, because sitting in the discomfort of someone else's pain is so hard. So in that it does feel powerless. When you're listening to somebody you love talk about something that happened to them, you experience powerlessness. And so to sit in that powerless position with them could be the most healing, because when you jump to fix it, it may sound caring and loving, and you're going, but look, I'm trying to talk about fixing it because I'm the good guy. But really what it is you've taken yourself out of the role of vulnerability into the fix it. And now you're not
fixing it.
Right. You actually unintentionally just took the power role, right? Instead of staying and feeling what it's like and imagining and being there, then you're really actually sitting in a more vulnerable place that is a much more connecting, healing place for both.
So that's definitely the movement towards empathy. Because now we have two vulnerable people. So for those of you, thank you for hanging in with us today. And there's a couple of things. One is, to the question of what to do about it. Why don't you turn to your loved ones and continue this conversation in this super open, hopefully, as Dan Siegel says, with a FACES frame, which stands for flexible, adaptive, coherent, energetic, stable, meaning being curious and open, and continue the conversations with those close to you. I think they would appreciate it. And if you are one of the Me Too's, to keep talking and to get your story out there. It's so important. And to keep doing it and find a receptive listener and teach people how to listen. Teach them what you need.
Or for those that aren't ready and don't want to do the Me Too, that don't feel the pressure in the Me Too, because there shouldn't be a pressure in the Me Too. There's no disgrace in not getting out there in some public forum because that's your experience, but to find somebody that you can talk to so that you can help move to a more healing place.
So Mason, you look excited about that particular comment.
Absolutely. I definitely have interacted with a lot of people who feel pressured to share their story. And there's no pressure to share your story. There's no pressure, even if it maybe some guy is asking you more of those leading questions, like, well, then what happened? Tell me. That's not a necessary part. It can definitely, as we've already discussed, be super helpful and be very, that all the bonding, putting yourself in the vulnerable position, etc. But there's no requirement ever to share anything that you don't feel comfortable sharing, or to present yourself as anything that you don't want to present yourself as. That is never a requirement on anyone to share anything about their own experiences if they don't want to.
That's right. It's that gives the person the experience of having their boundary respected, which is directly healing for what has typically happened where their boundaries were violated.
Absolutely.
So another little Easter egg here, if it's not obvious yet, part of Mason's qualifications is we've spent quite a lot of time together. He is my firstborn, and I am super proud of him, and I hope that I can imagine that you all can hear in the way that he talks and presents himself some of why that his mom might be pretty proud of this little guy.
Learn from a smart one.
That's awesome.
I say little guy. He's 6'2". So, hey, thank you guys so much for hanging in here with us. And since you are still listening, we know that you must have gotten something valuable. So if that's the case, please share the episode and subscribe if you haven't already. And here's the really cool thing. We're going to do a live conference with David Elliott, author of Attachment Disturbances in Adult, co-author of Attachment Disturbances in Adults here in Austin, Texas on April 7th.
So come join,
yes,
no matter where you are.
We've got people coming from overseas to see this thing, so it's really cool. And then also...
And you'll love Austin.
That's right. There is a reading group online, so you don't even have to come to Austin. There's a reading group that you can sign up for now. It starts in January that we're co-sponsoring with Austin in Connection. All the proceeds will go to this nonprofit that teaches the world about relational sciences and brings training to therapists about it.
And it's the reading group on the same book.
That's right. It's the reading group on David Elliott.
And if you can't make it to Austin, that's another way to really get some in-depth training and experience with the book. And if you are coming to Austin, it's a way to really, really familiarize yourself before the conference, which is an awesome idea.
That's right. And you can find that at Eventbrite. You go to eventbrite.com, and it's BRITE, and just search Therapist Uncensored, and you will find several offerings actually there for us. All right, Mason, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank y'all for having me.
You were fantastic.
It was totally fun. All right.
All right, we'll see you around the bend.
Therapist Uncensored is Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott. This podcast is edited by Jack Anderson.